Case dismissed. The words echoed through the courtroom as Emma Carter gathered her notes, her heart pounding against her ribs. The young public defender glanced at her client, Daniel Hayes, his weathered face a mix of disbelief and cautious hope. 3 weeks ago, he'd been just another file on her overflowing desk. Homeless veteran, trespassing charge, probable guilty plea, her supervisor had said, sliding the folder across her desk. Should be quick. But something in Daniel's eyes when they first met in the holding cell, a flicker of dignity buried beneath layers of exhaustion, had stopped Emma from taking the easy route. Found shelter in an abandoned building during the storm, she read from the police report, raindrops still visible on the paper. His military ID card, tucked carefully in a plastic bag, was his only possession. That night, Emma stayed late, her office lamp casting shadows across stacks of legal precedents. The building owner had failed safety inspections repeatedly. The property had been condemned for months. Someone was cutting corners, and Daniel had become collateral damage. In court, Emma stood tall, despite trembling hands. My client didn't break into a functioning building, Your Honor. He sought refuge in a dangerous structure that should have been secured by the owner. The same owner who has violated city code 17 times. The district attorney's smirk faded as Emma placed photographs on the evidence table, images of broken windows, missing locks, collapsed stairs. The city itself declared this building uninhabitable last winter. The real criminal negligence isn't my client's presence, but the owner's absence. As Daniel walked free, he stopped before the courthouse steps, the afternoon sun highlighting the silver in his hair. Nobody's fought for me like that since Afghanistan, he whispered, extending a hand that had once carried a rifle, but now carried little more than memories. 3 days later, a letter arrived at Emma's office. Inside was a worn military patch and a note. You reminded me what it feels like to have someone stand beside you when the world wants you invisible. Some battles aren't fought with weapons. Emma pinned the patch to her bulletin board. A daily reminder that sometimes true justice wears unexpected faces and speaks with a voice that refuses to be silenced. Objection overruled. The prosecutor's voice cut through the courtroom like a knife, his expensive suit a stark contrast to Daniel Hayes' borrowed clothes. Emma Carter watched her client flinch at the sound, a small, almost imperceptible movement that spoke volumes. Your Honor, Mr. Hayes is a repeat offender. This is his third trespassing charge this year, the prosecutor declared, his polished shoes gleaming under the fluorescent lights as he paced before the judge. A quick conviction serves everyone's interests, but Emma had seen something in Daniel's eyes during their first meeting, not defiance or resignation, but a profound weariness that came from carrying invisible wounds. In the holding cell, he'd barely spoken, his calloused hands folded tightly in his lap, gaze fixed on the floor. I don't need your pity, he'd said when she introduced herself, his voice rough from disuse. Just get it over with. Night after night, Emma pored over his file, searching for threads to unravel. 3 purple hearts, honorable discharge. Then nothing. As if Daniel Hayes had simply vanished from the system designed to protect those who had protected others. During their second meeting, she noticed his hands, how they trembled slightly when the heating system kicked on with a thunderous rattle, how his eyes constantly scanned the room, mapping exits and entrances. When was the last time anyone from Veterans Affairs contacted you? She asked softly. The silence that followed was heavier than any answer could have been. In court, the prosecutor painted Daniel as a nuisance, a problem to be solved with incarceration. Society has rules, Your Honor. Mr. Hayes consistently chooses to break them. Emma stood, heart racing. Society also has obligations, Your Honor. My client didn't choose to be forgotten. She placed Daniel's military records before the court, commendations for valor under fire, letters from commanding officers praising his selfless courage. The system that promised to care for him has failed at every turn. Mr. Hayes sought shelter in an abandoned building because every door that should have been opened to him was closed. After the hearing, Daniel finally met her eyes. Why fight for someone nobody remembers? Emma's answer was simple. Because being forgotten doesn't make you invisible, not to me. That evening, as snow began to fall outside her office window, Emma added Daniel's case to a growing file labeled simply, "Not Forgotten." "Drop it, Carter!" Emma's boss loomed over her desk, his voice sharp enough to make heads turn across the public defender's office. "This Hayes case isn't worth the effort. He'll be back on the streets within a week anyway." Rain streaked down, the windows casting watery shadows across the case files scattered across Emma's desk. Daniel Hayes' folder lay open, his military photo paper-clipped to the corner, a younger man with clear eyes and a straight posture, before life and war had curved his spine with invisible weights. "Thompson's watching how you handle your caseload," her boss continued, voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The county prosecutor position opens next year. You keep tilting at windmills like this homeless vet, and you can kiss that recommendation goodbye." Emma's fingers brushed against the tarnished dog tags hanging from her desk lamp, her father's, from a war fought decades before Daniel's. She remembered how her father would sit silently on their porch some nights, eyes fixed on distant ghosts only he could see. "The world moves on," her father had told her once, "but sometimes soldiers stay behind, fighting battles no one else can see." That evening, Emma stayed late, the fluorescent lights humming overhead like distant aircraft. In Daniel's file, buried beneath police reports and court documents, she found his commendations, 3 Purple Hearts, citations for valor under fire, letters from commanding officers praising his quick thinking that had saved his entire unit. Then, like so many others, the system had simply forgotten him. In their next meeting, Daniel sat across from her, eyes downcast, hands folded with military precision despite their slight tremor. "Why are you doing this?" he asked suddenly, looking up. "Nobody fights this hard for people like me." Emma thought of her father's funeral, how the honor guard had folded the flag with reverent hands, how the bugler's notes had hung in the air like questions without answers. "My father came home from war," she said quietly, "but part of him never really returned. I think he would want me to remember that some battles don't end when the fighting stops." Daniel's eyes, clear for a moment like the young soldier in the photograph, met hers. "Your father would be proud." That night, Emma added her father's worn copy of Once a Warrior to her briefcase, alongside Daniel's file. Tomorrow she would stand before the court, carrying the weight of 2 soldiers' stories, one ended, one still unfolding, and remind the world that some debts can never be marked paid in full. Classified military service record. Emma's hands trembled as she turned the brittle pages of Daniel Hayes' service file, the fluorescent lights of her cramped office flickering above like the pulse of a fading heartbeat. What had begun as routine, preparation had transformed into a journey through battlefields she'd never walked. 3 medals for valor, a silver star, letters of commendation from generals whose names she recognized from history books. The black and white photograph clipped to his file showed a different Daniel, standing tall in desert fatigues, eyes clear and determined, the weight of responsibility sitting comfortably on shoulders not yet bent by civilian life. "Operation Sandstorm Hero Saves 12, read the faded newspaper clipping she'd found buried in digital archives. The image showed Daniel carrying a wounded comrade through billowing smoke, his uniform darkened with blood not his own. Emma spread the documents across her desk like battlefield maps, each piece telling a part of a story America preferred to forget. Honorable discharge, VE hospital visits that grew increasingly spaced apart, prescription medications, therapy sessions that suddenly stopped. Then the civilian casualties, foreclosure notices, medical bills, divorce papers, job applications, with not selected, stamped in cruel red ink. The last known address was 3 years old, a veterans' shelter that had since closed due to funding cuts. When Emma visited the abandoned warehouse where Daniel had been arrested, she found his meager possessions tucked into a corner: a weathered backpack, a torn sleeping bag, and a small tin box. Inside the box, wrapped in a faded bandana, lay his medals, polished despite everything, as if they were the last connection to the man he once was. That night, rain lashed against her apartment windows as Emma prepared her arguments. The prosecution would see only a homeless trespasser. The judge would see an overcrowded docket, but she would make them see the hero who still existed beneath the layers of societal neglect. Her phone buzzed. Her boss. Final warning: drop the Hayes case or forget your career advancement. Emma's eyes drifted to her father's photograph on the bookshelf, his uniform pressed and perfect, his smile hiding the nightmares he'd later confessed to her. "Some battles choose you," he'd told her once, "and those are the ones you can't walk away from." She silenced her phone and returned to her notes, the medals from Daniel's tin box now arranged before her like silent witnesses to a promise America had made and broken. Tomorrow, in that courtroom, she wouldn't just be defending Daniel Hayes. She'd be fighting for the hero America had left behind. "All rise!" The bailiff's command silenced the murmurs as Judge Eleanor Winters swept into Courtroom 7, her black robes billowing behind her like storm clouds. Emma Carter felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she stood beside Daniel Hayes, who remained statue still, his borrowed suit hanging from shoulders that had once carried wounded comrades across battlefields. "The state versus Daniel Hayes," the clerk announced, voice echoing through the wood-paneled chamber. Prosecutor James Mitchell rose with practiced confidence, his tailored suit and polished cufflinks gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. "Your Honor, the defendant is a repeat offender and public nuisance. This is his third trespassing violation this year alone." Mitchell strode toward the jury, his voice dripping with rehearsed concern. "The business owners of this district deserve protection from individuals who repeatedly disregard property laws. Mr. Hayes has been offered assistance numerous times and has rejected it. The state recommends maximum sentencing to send a clear message." Daniel's weathered hands tightened into fists on the table, knuckles white with tension. Emma noticed how his eyes darted to the exits, mapping escape routes, a soldier's instinct. Never quite forgotten. When Emma's turn came, she stood slowly, the weight of Daniel's service record in her hands, feeling heavier than any law book she'd ever carried. "Your Honor, the man sitting before you today isn't just a name on a docket. Staff Sergeant Daniel Hayes received the Silver Star for pulling 12 soldiers from a burning transport under enemy fire." She placed the medals on the evidence table, their polished surfaces catching the light. "The building where my client sought shelter during last month's freezing temperatures had been abandoned for years. The property owner, who, I might add, has 17 outstanding code violations, failed to secure the premises as required by city ordinance." Judge Winters peered down through narrow spectacles, her expression unmoved. "Miss Carter, while Sergeant Hayes' service is commendable, this court deals with his actions today, not yesterday's heroics." Emma felt a flash of heat rise to her cheeks. "With all due respect, Your Honor, yesterday's heroics are precisely why he deserves today's justice. The system promised to care for him when he returned home. That promise was broken." The judge's gavel cut through the air like a bullet. "Counselor, this courtroom is not the place for political statements about veterans' affairs." As Emma took her seat, Daniel whispered, his voice barely audible, "You can't win this. Nobody ever does." Emma's hand found his briefly under the table. Then it's time someone did. "The defense calls Colonel James Richardson." Emma's voice rang through the courtroom, stronger than she felt. A collective murmur rippled through the gallery as the bailiff opened the door. The man who entered moved with military precision despite his civilian clothes, a charcoal suit that couldn't quite disguise the soldier beneath. Silver-streaked hair cut regulation short, spine ramrod straight, eyes that missed nothing as they swept the courtroom. When they landed on Daniel, something flickered across the colonel's face. Recognition, pain, determination. Daniel's head snapped up, eyes widening in disbelief. "Colonel?" he whispered, the word barely audible. After the oath, Emma approached the witness stand. "Colonel Richardson, could you please tell the court your relationship to the defendant?" "Staff Sergeant Hayes served under my command during 3 tours in Afghanistan. He was one of the finest soldiers I've ever had the privilege to lead." The colonel's voice filled the courtroom, authoritative, unwavering, a voice accustomed to being heard and obeyed. Emma noticed how the judge sat slightly straighter, how the prosecutor's smug expression faltered. "Could you describe the incident that earned Sergeant Hayes the Silver Star?" Richardson's jaw tightened. "Our convoy was ambushed. IED took out the lead vehicle. Heavy enemy fire pinned us down. Hayes pulled 3 wounded soldiers from a burning Humvee, then went back again and again until everyone was accounted for. 12 men came home to their families because of what he did that day." Emma handed him a photograph, Daniel carrying a wounded comrade through billowing smoke. "And this, Colonel, that's Hayes. He had shrapnel in his leg, but refused evacuation until everyone else was out." What happened when Sergeant Hayes returned home? The colonel's military composure cracked slightly. The system failed him. Bureaucratic delays in treatment, paperwork disasters. By the time his benefits were finally approved, he'd lost his home, his marriage, everything. The prosecutor shot to his feet. "Objection! This testimony is irrelevant to the trespassing charge." "Your Honor," Emma countered, "it goes directly to intent. My client wasn't seeking to damage property or commit a crime. He was seeking shelter, something our system promised but failed to provide." The judge hesitated, then nodded. "Overruled. Continue." Richardson leaned forward, his gaze fixed on the judge. "Your Honor, I've commanded hundreds of soldiers. Daniel Hayes saved more lives than anyone I've ever served with. And when he needed us, when he needed his country, we left him behind." As the colonel stepped down, he paused beside Daniel, placing a hand on his shoulder, a gesture between warriors. In that moment, Daniel's posture changed, straightening almost imperceptibly, as if remembering the soldier he once was. "Rules exist for a reason." Prosecutor Mitchell's voice sliced through the courtroom's hushed silence as he rose for his closing argument. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting harsh rectangles of light across the polished floor, illuminating some faces while leaving others in shadow. "While we all appreciate Sergeant Hayes' military service," Mitchell continued, pacing before the bench with measured steps, "this courtroom exists to uphold the law, not to make exceptions based on sympathy." His Italian leather shoes clicked against the marble floor, each step precise and deliberate. The facts remain undisputed. The defendant was found trespassing on private property, not once, not twice, but 3 times this year alone. He held up 3 fingers, letting them hover in the air like accusations. Property owners have rights, communities have standards. If we start making exceptions based on personal circumstances, where does it end? Emma watched Daniel's face grow, more ashen with each word, his shoulders curving inward as if bracing for an incoming shell. Colonel Richardson sat rigidly in the gallery, jaw clenched so tight a muscle twitched beneath his skin. "Your Honor." Mitchell's voice softened to something, almost resembling compassion. "We can acknowledge Sergeant Hayes' service while still holding him accountable. The law must apply equally to heroes and civilians alike. The prosecution recommends 6 months in county jail, followed by supervised probation. Judge Winters nodded almost imperceptibly, her pen hovering over her notes. The court reporters, fingers clacked against keys, recording what felt increasingly like a foregone conclusion. "Ms. Carter," the judge said, peering over her reading glasses, "your passionate defense is noted, but Mr. Mitchell raises valid points about equal application of the law." Emma felt ice forming in her stomach as she watched the judge's expression. Hardened into judicial resolve, Daniel sat motionless beside her, a man already resigned to another battlefield loss. "Before I render my decision," Judge Winters continued, shuffling papers before her, "I want to be clear that while this court respects military service, it cannot create a separate standard of justice based solely on prior commendable actions." From the corner of her eye, Emma saw Daniel's hand move to his chest, fingers unconsciously searching for dog tags no longer there. She thought of her father's voice. "Sometimes the hardest fight comes after the war ends." The courtroom clock ticked mercilessly forward as Judge Winters cleared her throat, pen poised to write a sentence that would send a decorated hero to a cell while the country he'd bled for looked away. Emma rose to her feet, one final desperate strategy forming even as the judge began to speak. "Attention on deck!" The command echoed through the courtroom, freezing Judge Winters' words mid-sentence. The massive oak doors at the back of the chamber swung open with military precision, hinges protesting the sudden movement with an ancient groan. Sunlight from the corridor silhouetted the figures standing at attention, 6 uniformed soldiers, combat ribbons adorning their chests, berets held precisely at their sides. Their sudden appearance sent ripples of murmurs through the gallery as necks craned and bodies shifted to witness the unexpected interruption. "What is the meaning of this?" Judge Winters demanded, her gavel hovering threateningly above its sound block. The courtroom fell into a stunned silence, broken only by the synchronized footfalls of polished boots against marble as the soldiers marched forward in perfect formation. At their center walked a man whose uniform carried the weight of authority. Aze, general, his chest a tapestry of service and sacrifice. His weathered face bore the lines of countless decisions, eyes that had seen both victory and loss now fixed firmly on the bench. Daniel Hayes rose instinctively to his feet, muscle memory, overriding everything else, a soldier's response to superior rank. His borrowed suit couldn't disguise the military bearing that suddenly straightened his spine, his hand twitching at his side in an aborted salute. Emma stood frozen beside her client, legal arguments evaporating from her mind as the soldiers formed a line directly behind the defense table, their presence transforming the mundane courthouse into something that felt sacred and solemn. "General William Harrington, Your Honor," the leader announced, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to battlefields rather than courtrooms. 25th Infantry Division, I request permission to address this court regarding Staff Sergeant Daniel Hayes. The prosecutor half rose from his seat, objection forming on his lips, but something in the general's unwavering gaze made him slowly sink back down. The judge's expression shifted between confusion and curiosity as she regarded the military presence that had commandeered her courtroom. "This is highly irregular," she said, but her voice had lost its edge of certainty. "So is abandoning our own, Your Honor," the general replied quietly. Colonel Richardson stood from the gallery, moving to join the line of uniforms. One by one, others rose throughout the courtroom. Men and women in civilian clothes, whose bearing marked them unmistakably as veterans, forming a silent wall of solidarity. Emma felt tears prickling behind her eyes as she watched Daniel's expression transform, disbelief giving way to something he might have forgotten existed, hope. "Permission to approach, Your Honor." The first soldier stepped forward, a tall man with a prosthetic leg visible beneath his uniform pants. his chest adorned with combat ribbons that told silent stories of battlefields far from this marble courtroom. Judge Winters, momentarily overwhelmed by the unexpected military presence, nodded wordlessly. The soldier moved to stand directly before the bench, back straight, eyes forward. "Staff Sergeant Marcus Wilson, 25th Infantry," he announced, voice steady despite the emotion rippling beneath his words. "On April 17, 2014, I was trapped in a burning transport after an IED strike. My leg was shattered. Enemy fire was pouring in from 3 directions." His gaze shifted to Daniel. "Sergeant Hayes pulled me out while taking fire. The doctors said another 30 seconds in that vehicle and I wouldn't be standing here today." Before the judge could respond, another soldier stepped forward, younger, with a burn scar tracing a path down his neck beneath his crisp uniform collar. "Corporal James Rodriguez, Your Honor. When our position was overrun, Sergeant Hayes held off the enemy single-handedly so the rest of us could evacuate the wounded. He was the last man out, carrying our radio operator on his shoulders, despite his own injuries." The courtroom had fallen into a reverent silence, the only sound the soft footfalls of each soldier who came forward. A third man approached, medals glinting under the courtroom lights. Lieutenant Chris Erickson. After the ambush, Hayes administered first aid that saved my life, using his own shirt as a tourniquet. When the medevac couldn't land, he carried me 3 miles to the extraction point. One by one, they stepped forward, living testimonials to moments where Daniel Hayes had chosen valor over self-preservation. Each story painted pieces of a portrait, a soldier who had repeatedly risked everything to ensure others made it home. Daniel sat motionless, eyes fixed on his folded hands, shoulders bearing the weight of memories these men had carried back into his present. The final soldier approached, the youngest of them all, scarcely more than a boy beneath his uniform. "Private First Class Kevin Delaney, Your Honor. I was on my first deployment, pinned down under heavy fire. Sergeant Hayes could have retreated to safety. Instead, he moved toward the danger to reach me." His voice broke slightly. "Everyone else had given me up for dead, but Sergeant Hayes said, 'We don't leave our own behind.'" The private turned to face Daniel directly, eyes shining with unshed tears. "You never left us behind, Sergeant, and we're not leaving you behind either." Throughout the courtroom, the phrase was echoed in whispers, "We don't leave our own behind." "Your Honor, may I speak?" The question hung in the air as General Harrington stepped forward, his medals catching the light streaming through the high courtroom windows. Unlike the soldiers who had spoken before him, his approach was not a request, but a presence that commanded the room's attention. Judge Winters, visibly moved by the testimonies but still clinging to judicial protocol, nodded silently. The general removed his beret, holding it at his side as he stood directly before the bench. His eyes, steady and unflinching, met the judge's gaze with quiet intensity. "I've commanded troops in 3 conflicts across 2 decades, he began, his voice carrying to every corner of the hushed courtroom. "I've written letters to families of fallen soldiers. I've pinned medals on heroes and buried friends." He paused, the weight of those memories visible in the set of his shoulders. "In all those years, I've seen courage take many forms. But Sergeant Hayes," he turned slightly, gesturing toward Daniel, "showed the rarest kind, the kind that moves toward danger when every instinct screams to run." Daniel sat perfectly still, his borrowed tie suddenly too tight, his eyes fixed on some middle distance, as if seeing not the courtroom but the battlefield where these bonds had been forged in fire and blood. "Your Honor," the general continued, his voice dropping to something more intimate, compelling everyone to lean forward, "our nation makes a sacred promise to those who serve. Sometimes that promise gets buried under paperwork and procedures. Sometimes we fail them." He straightened to his full height, shoulders squared. If it weren't for this man, 12 soldiers wouldn't be standing here today. 12 families would have received folded flags instead of welcoming their loved ones. Home. His hand came to rest on the wooden barrier separating the gallery from the proceedings. I'm not asking you to ignore the law. I'm asking you to remember its purpose, justice. And I'm asking you this question. Should a hero really be punished for falling on hard times after we failed to honor our promise to him? The final question lingered in the air, unanswered. Somewhere in the back of the courtroom, a single cough broke the silence, then nothing. Emma glanced at the prosecutor, whose eyes were now fixed on his legal pad, pen motionless in his hand. The court reporter's fingers hovered above the keys, waiting. Daniel finally looked up, meeting the general's gaze, a silent exchange between warriors that spoke of battlefields and brotherhood beyond the understanding of those who had never served. Judge Winters removed her glasses slowly, her judicial mask slipping just enough to reveal the human beneath the robes, considering a question with no easy answer. Court will recess for 15 minutes. Judge Winters' voice cut through the heavy silence as she rose abruptly, black robes billowing behind her as she disappeared through the door behind the bench. The courtroom remained frozen until the heavy oak door clicked shut. Emma turned to Daniel, whose weathered face betrayed no emotion, a soldier's mask perfected through years of hiding pain. Around them, the uniformed men stood at parade rest, their presence transforming the ordinary courtroom into something that felt like hallowed ground. Minutes stretched like hours, marked only by the ancient wall clock's methodical ticking. When the bailiff finally called, "All rise," the collective intake of breath was audible as Judge Winters returned, her expression unreadable as she settled back into her chair. Her hands rested on Daniel's file, now open to reveal the photographs of his military service alongside the police, reports that had brought him into her courtroom. For a long moment, she simply studied the documents before her, the silence growing heavier with each passing second. "In my 20 years on this bench," she finally began, her voice softer than before, "I have strived to apply the law equally to all who come before me." She removed her glasses, meeting Daniel's eyes directly for the first time. "But justice, without mercy, is a cold companion indeed." She closed the file with deliberate care. "This court finds that the interests of justice would not be served by punishing a man who has already sacrificed so much." The words hung in the air like a promise finally fulfilled. Case dismissed. A murmur rippled through the gallery as she continued, "However, this court will not simply open the door and send Sergeant Hayes back to the streets." Her gavel pointed toward the prosecutor. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm ordering the district attorney's office to coordinate with Veterans Affairs immediately. I want housing secured today, medical appointments scheduled this week, and benefits expedited." The prosecutor nodded, earlier righteousness replaced by something resembling shame. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "I'm requiring monthly progress reports until Sergeant Hayes is properly settled." She fixed the general with a firm gaze. "And I expect the military to do its part as well." "Without question, Your Honor," General Harrington replied. As realization dawned across Daniel's face, Emma noticed something shift in his posture. The subtle straightening of shoulders too long bent by invisible weights. His hand trembled slightly as he reached up to wipe moisture from eyes that had remained dry through battlefields and abandonment. "Court is adjourned," Judge Winters declared, her gavel falling not with its usual sharp crack, but with a gentle tap, the sound of a door opening rather than closing. "It's over." The words echoed through the courtroom as the judge's gavel fell with a gentle finality. Emma turned to Daniel, expecting relief, but what she saw instead stole her breath away. For weeks, Daniel Hayes had kept his gaze downcast. A man accustomed to being invisible, to being walked past on street corners, to being a problem rather than a person. His shoulders had remained permanently curved inward, as if perpetually bracing for impact, his voice rarely rising above a whisper. But now, as the weight of imminent punishment lifted from his shoulders, something transformed in him, like watching. Dawn break over a landscape long shrouded in darkness. Daniel looked up. His eyes, once dulled by years of struggle, now reflected the light streaming through the tall courthouse windows. Emma watched as tears gathered but didn't fall, hanging suspended like morning dew, too precious to be shed carelessly after years of careful emotional rationing. "I don't understand," he whispered, the words barely audible as his weathered hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white as if afraid this moment might slip away if he didn't hold tight. "Why would they come for me?" Around them, the soldiers stood at attention, living monuments to promises kept and brotherhood that transcended time and circumstance. Colonel Richardson approached, resting a hand on Daniel's shoulder, a gesture that seemed to anchor him to this new reality where he was no longer forgotten. "Because you never left them behind," Emma answered softly, her own vision blurring as she watched dignity return to his posture, breath by breath, the soldier emerging from beneath layers of hardship and neglect. When Daniel finally rose to his own feet, it wasn't with the hesitant movements of a man accustomed to courtroom defeat, but with the squared shoulders of someone remembering who he once was, who he still was beneath it all. "Thank you," he said, his voice finding strength with each word, "for seeing me when nobody else did." Emma thought of her father's dog tags hanging from her desk lamp, of late-night stories whispered on their porch, of the invisible wounds he'd carried home from a different war. "They were always looking for you," she said. "They just needed help finding their way." Outside the courtroom, sunlight bathed the courthouse steps in gold as Daniel walked between his brothers in arms, no longer a man apart, but one returning to his rightful place. Emma watched from the doorway as he straightened his borrowed tie, his silhouette transforming with each step. A hero walking back into the light after too long in the shadows. In his eyes now shone something that transcended mere relief or gratitude. The rekindling of a flame too long deprived of oxygen. Hope. "Excuse me, counselor." The voice cut through the courthouse hallway's chaos as Emma gathered her scattered notes, the adrenaline of victory still coursing through her veins. She turned to find a woman standing nearby, tall with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a precise bun, her navy blazer adorned with a subtle Veterans Organization pin. "That was quite something in there," the woman said, extending her hand. "Margaret Wilson, Director of Veterans Justice Alliance. Do you have a moment to talk?" The courthouse corridor bustled around them, a river of humanity flowing past. Other cases, other lives, the relentless machinery of justice grinding forward. But here, in this eddy of calm, Emma felt something shift in the foundation of her world. "I've been watching your work on the Hayes case," Margaret continued, her eyes sharp with intelligence and purpose. "Most attorneys would have pushed for a quick plea deal. You fought like someone who understands what's at stake." Emma's thoughts drifted to her office desk drawer, where her father's letters from Vietnam sat bundled in faded ribbon, words she'd memorized as a child, trying to understand. The man who sometimes woke screaming in the night, fighting battles long since ended. "My father was a veteran," Emma replied, the words feeling inadequate against the weight of what that truly meant. "He came home, but something in him never really returned." Margaret nodded, understanding flowing between them without need for elaboration. Every day, veterans walk into courtrooms without anyone who truly sees them, not just their charges, but their service, their struggles, the system that failed them. A shaft of afternoon sunlight streamed through the high windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air between them. In the courtroom behind them, another case was already being called, the world moving on while Emma stood at a crossroads she hadn't seen coming. Our organization provides legal advocacy for veterans caught in the justice system, Margaret explained, her voice taking on a quiet intensity. We need attorneys who fight the way you just did, who see the person beneath the charge, who understand that justice sometimes requires looking beyond the letter of the law to its spirit. Emma glanced down at her case files, briefs for corporate disputes and municipal violations, cases that suddenly felt hollow compared to what she just experienced. It wouldn't be the path to becoming a prosecutor, Margaret said, reading her thoughts, but it might be the path to becoming something more. From the courthouse steps outside came the sound of laughter. Daniel, surrounded by his brothers in arms, a man reclaiming his place in a circle that had never truly closed. Emma thought of her father's voice. Find work that heals, Emmy, not just work that pays. When can I start, she asked, the words feeling like coming home. New beginnings. The sign above the entrance to Veterans Haven glinted in the morning sunlight as Daniel Hayes stood at the threshold, a duffel bag containing his few possessions slung over his shoulder. The brick building, once an abandoned school, now transformed into transitional housing, stood 3 stories tall, windows gleaming with fresh paint and renewed purpose. First day's always the hardest, said Colonel Richardson beside him, a steady presence since the courthouse steps 2 weeks ago. After that, it gets easier. One day at a time, soldier. Daniel nodded, swallowing against the tightness in his throat. After years of sleeping in shelters and abandoned buildings, the prospect of a room with his name on the door felt almost unreal, a dream his mind had fabricated to shield him from harsher realities. Inside, the walls were adorned with photographs of veterans who had passed through these halls before him, faces that had arrived bearing the same shadows he carried, now smiling from graduation ceremonies, new jobs, family reunions. Evidence of possibilities he had stopped believing existed. This is your space, the program director explained, opening the door to a simple but clean room with a bed, desk, and a window overlooking a small garden. Your appointments with the VA are scheduled for Thursday. Job training starts Monday. Daniel set his bag down carefully, his fingers tracing the edge of the desk. Solid, real, his. On the wall hung a small corkboard, empty except for a single note pinned to its center. The mission continues. Keep moving forward. The first week passed in a blur of medical appointments, therapy sessions, paperwork being filed and processed by people who looked him in the eye when they spoke. The second week brought job training. His hands, once skilled at field stripping weapons in darkness, now learning to rebuild computer systems in a veterans tech program. In the dining hall one evening, he spotted a familiar face, Private Rodriguez, one of the soldiers from the courtroom, now a program mentor. Sergeant Hayes, he called, waving Daniel over. Come meet the guys. The circle widened to include him, conversations flowing around topics civilian and military alike. For the first time in years, Daniel felt the invisible barrier between himself and the world beginning to thin. On his nightstand sat a business card, Emma Carter, Veterans Justice Alliance, and a photograph of his old unit, faces young and determined, unaware of the roads that lay ahead. Each night, before sleep claimed him, Daniel would look at their faces and whisper a promise that had once been buried beneath shame and survival. Keep moving forward. 3 months later, when Daniel stood before a classroom of fellow veterans, sharing his journey from battlefield to streets to redemption, his voice no longer faltered when he said, "The hardest part isn't finding shelter. It's believing you deserve to come home." Outside his window, spring buds pushed through soil long dormant, persistent, determined, awakening once more. "Counselor Carter!" The familiar voice echoed through the courthouse corridor, pulling Emma's attention from the case files clutched against her chest. She turned, momentarily frozen in place by what she saw. The man approaching her through the bustling hallway was almost unrecognizable, clean-shaven, hair neatly trimmed, shoulders squared beneath a crisp button-down shirt. Only the eyes remained unchanged, carrying memories of battlefields she would never know, though they now held something she hadn't seen before: peace. "Daniel," she breathed, a smile spreading across her face. "You look like a civilian again," he finished, the corner of his mouth lifting in a half-smile. "Still getting used to it myself." Sunlight streamed through the high courthouse windows, catching the silver at his temples that made him look distinguished rather than worn. Around them, the daily drama of the justice system unfolded, lawyers hurrying between courtrooms, clients waiting nervously on benches, the constant hum of a system that rarely paused to celebrate its successes. "The Veterans Haven program is working out," he continued, his voice stronger than she remembered. "Got a job starting next week, IT support at the VA hospital." His hands, once restless and uncertain, now moved with purpose as he spoke. "They tell me I have a knack for fixing broken things." Emma noticed a small velvet box in his hand, worn at the edges as if carried for years. Daniel followed her gaze, his expression turning solemn. "I wanted to give you something," he said, extending the box toward her. "It's not much, but—" Emma opened it carefully, breath catching as she revealed a bronze star nestled against faded blue velvet, its ribbon slightly frayed at the edges. "This was my first medal," Daniel explained quietly, "for actions that saved my unit during my first tour. Colonel Richardson helped me track it down from storage." His voice dropped lower. "It's the only thing I have that means anything." Emma's fingers hovered above it, understanding the weight of what he was offering, not just metal and ribbon, but a piece of himself, before the world had turned hard and cold. "In the military," Daniel continued, "this represents courage under fire, but what you did in that courtroom, standing up when nobody else would, that took a different kind of courage." As Emma carefully closed the box, cradling it in her palm, Daniel straightened to attention, a soldier's gesture of respect. "You reminded me that I'm still worth fighting for," he said simply. "Thank you for seeing the man and not just the case number." Outside, rain began to fall, gentle drops catching the light like tears or prayers. Inside, in a courthouse hallway, usually witness to broken stories, two lives forever changed by justice, finally served, stood bathed in quiet triumph. Lives changed forever. Emma stood at her office window, watching twilight descend over the city. The bronze star medal rested in her palm, catching the last golden rays of sunlight that filtered through the blinds. One case, one man, one decision: to fight when surrender would have been easier. On her desk lay a stack of new files, veterans facing charges that masked deeper wounds, warriors who had returned home only to find themselves fighting invisible battles on unfamiliar terrain. The Veterans Justice Alliance badge, now pinned to her lapel, reflected her new purpose, a path that had found her rather than one she had chosen. Daniel's words echoed in her mind. "You reminded me that I'm still worth fighting for." She had seen similar transformations in the weeks since, men and women standing taller, eyes lifting to meet the world again, dignity returning breath by breath. Her father had once told her, "Justice isn't just about laws, it's about seeing people when the world has rendered them invisible." In that courtroom, she hadn't merely defended a homeless veteran. She had affirmed that valor doesn't expire, that promises should be kept, that every person deserves to be truly seen. The medal in her hand wasn't a weight, but a reminder. Courage takes many forms, and sometimes the most powerful act is simply refusing to look away when the world has moved on.